Well, I'm still Martha Minow, and it is my great pleasure to welcome back to campus our distinguished alum, Matthew Olson, who recently stepped down from his critical role as director of the National Counterterrorism Center. I'm going to say just brief words about his background because I want to reserve as much time as possible to talk about his important subjects. And I also will make sure that there's time for questions from you all. So Matt clerked out of law school for Judge Norma Holloway Johnson before he then went to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. And I want you to remember that. He started the Civil Rights Division. He became a federal prosecutor. He worked as the first director of the Office of National Security Division and Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department's National Security Division. He headed the Guantanamo Review Task Force. He served also as Associate Deputy Attorney General, General Counsel of the National Security Agency, and then became the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Unfortunately, the things that you've become an expert in, Matt, have become very front page news for all of us. And I think, if you don't mind, I'm going to dive right in, along with my gratitude for your service to the country, and ask you about ISIL, ISIS. What explains the rise of this group? Is it sudden? How much was known? How much of a threat is it to the United States?
Well, thank you. Let me just say at the beginning, thank you for the introduction, and it's a real treat for me to be here. I have two of my first-year professors here, in Professor Hyman and Professor Minow, Civil Procedure and Crim Law from Section 4.
And you live to tell the tale.
And I live to tell the tale, so that's pretty amazing. And you can, all you students, I mean, you can imagine what it's like for me to be here 30 years later with my professors talking at the law school. And so, my last day actually in the government was Friday. I just left the National Counterterrorism Center, where ISIL and all the rest of the things that we're worried about were, part of the daily drill for us. And so, if I look a little relaxed, I feel a little bit more relaxed, not having started the day with an hour of threat briefings, waking up in the morning, looking at my BlackBerry, seeing if anything blew up overnight, being glad that it didn't. That was pretty much how I started my day. I mean, I don't want to over dramatize it. It's a great government job, a great organization, but and it's a little unsettling and disorienting to be here actually as a private citizen and not in the government. I spent the last 22 years consecutively in the government, 24 total with my clerkship. So that's pretty much what I did and what I've been doing, and now I got to figure out what I'm going to do next. But I'm not going to start each day with a classified briefing. So that's some degree of comfort and going forward.
You come on in, people who are outside the room. Come on in.
I just commented to Dean Minow. It's really I think somewhat of a tribute to the law school that that there's this many people here. Maybe it's the rain, maybe it's the free pizza, but I think it's a tribute to the students that there's so many folks here at lunchtime to talk about terrorism, and shows how engaged you are as students. It's really gratifying. So, all right, to the substance a little bit. I mean, we're all really, we've been completely seized with ISIL or ISIS or IS, depending on what you call it, the group. We call it in the government, we call it ISIL. You'll notice the president's referred to it as that. It's partly because that's what we designated the group in the State Department designation process, was ISIL. So we're sticking with that name because that's what it's designated as, a foreign terrorist organization. So Islamic State for Syria and the Levant. Where did this group come from? It's really been around since 2004 as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it was the group that Zarqawi started in 2004, and when he pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden. It's gone through a number of iterations. It's waxed and waned. It was really on its heels from 2007 when Zarqawi was killed to 2011, but it's been resurgent since then, obviously. It's got a number of significant advantages. Did this group just kind of pop on the scene? I mean, the president made some comments the other day about how, the question whether we were surprised by the group when he appeared on 60 Minutes. You know, I think inside the intelligence community, we feel like we've been talking about this quite a bit, this group, over the last couple of years in terms of its resurgence in Iraq. The number of bombings in Iraq in 2011, just in Baghdad, went from about 10 a month to about 30 to 40 a month in 2013. And we watched this happen. We talked about it quite a bit. What we didn't, I think, predict, and this was part of the comments the president made, in terms of the group's rise, is the failure of the Iraqi security forces to be an effective fighting force. I mean, basically 3 or 4 divisions essentially melted away when ISIL took Mosul in August. So, you know, the group has, it hasn't really just sprung on the scene as it may seem. We've been watching it for some time, but it has a number of key advantages. Its numbers rank, we think, probably as many as 30,000. It's got about 12 to 15,000 foreign fighters augmenting that. It's got a lot of resources. We think probably $1 million, maybe even upwards of $2 million a day from oil sales. It's proven to be a really effective fighting force. It's got long-term strategic plan. It's proven itself to be extraordinarily violent. It's as good as any group, if not better, at propaganda. So it's got a number of advantages, and that's why, basically, in answer to your question, we are so focused on it right now.
What are its goals?
The sort of stated goal is to establish an Islamic caliphate, and it's taken some significant steps in that direction, particularly in terms of geography. You know, as a group, it now holds this sort of valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates, sort of the heart of the Middle East, this swath of geography in Syria and Iraq.
Cradle of civilization. The
cradle of civilization. And now, at least for the time being, it holds that area. So and its goal is to establish a caliphate that's expansive beyond that area to include other countries in the region, Jordan and Lebanon in particular. Its goal is to, as well, is to take over the mantle as the leading group of sort of a global movement, to take that from Al-Qaeda core in Pakistan to become that group. And then, in terms of the United States, its strategic goal is to take on the United States. At least it sees us as a strategic enemy. That with us, it sees conflict as inevitable. These go back to statements that its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, made back in January.
What is the threat to the United States, both our interests and physically inside this nation?
So I think it's really important, and I've tried to, in my job at the National Counterterrorism Center, you know, we're in the intelligence community. We don't talk a lot in public. I haven't made many public statements. I testify in Congress sometimes publicly, and this is a long way to answer your question, sort of, but I'll get to it. But the idea, the 9/11 Commission earlier this year issued its sort of follow-up report 10 years after its initial report, and one of the points it made is that we need to do a better job in the intelligence community of talking about the threat and making sure that it's understood, so it's not overblown and it's not underestimated. And it's kind of hard for us. The intelligence community isn't very good at that. And one thing we probably will talk about today, one example of where one reason why it's important is, in particular, when we are seeking to have new capabilities, particularly like in the surveillance realm. So how do we understand the balance and the trade-off we're making when we ask for particular authorities if we're not being open and explicit about the nature of what we're taking on with that authority? And trying to get that right is difficult because a lot of obviously what we deal with is classified. But I do think it's really important, and this is a good opportunity for me to this group, but I think more broadly than this, to talk about the threat, and in particular to be really precise and rigorous in thinking about a group like ISIL and the threat it poses to the United States. So in terms of that question, the threat it poses to us is really most acute in the region, in Iraq in particular. It's quite direct and immediate to our personnel who are in our embassy in Baghdad, in our consulate in Erbil. I mean, these places are under direct threat by terrorist forces, particularly ISIL. They've made advances toward Baghdad. They have plotted to take out attacks against the green zone, the international zone where our embassy is. They're making advances toward Erbil when we started the airstrikes in that area. So it's a direct threat to us there. It's also a threat not quite as acute and not as sort of direct to us in the region. I mean, they've carried out attacks in Lebanon. They've plotted and have a capability in Jordan, in Turkey. And these are places where we obviously have interest, and more we could be targeted there or even caught in the crossfire. In Europe, there is actually active plotting by ISIL in Europe and in the UK. The Prime Minister talked about that. That's where they've, we think that they've made efforts to have an operational capability. That's, I think, the most significant area where we would likely be targeted. An example of that is the attack back in May in a Jewish museum in Brussels that killed 4 people by an ISIL militant. Unclear whether that person was sort of sent there and directed to carry out that attack or did that on his own, but nonetheless he had fought with ISIL and was connected to ISIL. Now here in the homeland in the U.S., we don't see any cells, in the United States. We haven't seen any indication of plotting here in the United States. We are concerned about the number of foreign fighters. We've talked a lot about this. It's been in the press a lot. They're probably significantly more than 100 at this point. We've been talking about more than 100. That number continues to grow in terms of numbers. Be really clear on this. Number of foreign U.S. persons who've gone to Syria to fight. Not all of them have joined ISIL. Not all of them have joined an extremist group. They've gone there to fight. But the concern is that they could come back and carry out an attack. Or the other thing I mentioned, the propaganda that ISIL has proven itself to be quite capable with, and that could inspire someone who's here who's got no connection to ISIL. They just are, one of the number of, we refer to them as homegrown violent extremists who would be motivated by that kind of propaganda to take action. And that's very difficult for us to stop. I mean, it's quite close to home. The Boston Marathon attack and the Tsarnaev sort of fit that model.
Well, and certainly Britain is struggling with that, and Canada is struggling with it as well, interestingly.
Yeah, interestingly, Canada does have an issue there as well.
So can I ask a double-barreled question? What's our strategy, and what's our legal basis for that strategy?
Right, I figured we might get around to the legal basis after all. I might turn that back around on you guys. So the strategy, and the president now at this point has talked quite a bit about this, and others in the administration. It's against the backdrop of if you're interested in this, you can look at the president's speeches that he's made on national security going back to 2009, the National Archives, going forward to the National Defense University in 2013, and another speech at West Point, where he's talked about the broad strategy of protecting U.S. interests and being aggressive where we see a direct threat to us, being a significant part of the strategy, but equally important is building capability and capacity in other countries to take on this fight. So it's not just the United States acting alone. So consistent with that, at least our initial concerns were to protect our people, as I mentioned, our embassy, our consulate, avert a humanitarian crisis in Iraq, where we saw that there were potential for sort of humanitarian catastrophes. That was sort of the initial stages. Amerli being one place, Mount Sinjar being the other, where they've been laid siege to by ISIL forces. So we sort of got through that phase. That was early September. Now the broader strategy, multiple lines of effort, as we say in the government, sort of all of government, whole of government approach. Military effort using airstrikes, again, to sort of roll back ISIL gains, to limit their safe haven. Building, this is critical and needed to be sort of staged the right way. Helping to support an Iraqi transition to a government that was more inclusive. Part of the problem with ISIL, part of the reason it was so successful in Iraq was the sectarian tensions there and the disenchantment among the Sunni population. That along, of course, with the bigger issue really was the civil war in Syria, which created a complete security vacuum. So roll back their gains, create a transition in Iraq that would allow for a more inclusive government with significant progress in that front. Build an international coalition to be part of this effort that would include Arab allies, and now we're looking at probably as many as 40 countries. Provide support to the forces on the ground, the Iraqi security forces, the Kurdish Peshmerga, and then provide a train and equip support to Syrian moderates in Syria who are fighting there and fighting ISIL as well as the regime in Syria. So that's all kind of part of the military side, then, and the diplomatic side, and then on I guess more of even a longer term front, trying to roll back or trying to expose ISIL for who they are, and that's an ideological challenge. Working with our European allies, another line of effort to stem the flow of foreign fighters, build up our own intelligence capabilities in Syria and Iraq, and really continue to use the law enforcement tool where we have the opportunity to stop someone from going to Iraq to join with them. So lots of lines of effort there, all sort of complementary, but a couple cautionary notes, and I guess I'm a little more free to talk about some of the weaknesses. I think if I were just still last week, I would have just said, and that's the strategy, and I would
that's
stop
why we
there.
got you now.
So now I'm really, and I'm obviously still tied and supportive of the administration. I do think and the president acknowledged this in the 60 Minutes interview. The Iraq side of this is pretty straightforward. It's building up a political transition, building up the security forces, rolling back ISIL. And we've seen them. They're not invincible. One of the things I've tried to say is this group is, they rose quickly, but they have weaknesses, and we're going to be able to exploit those weaknesses. We've already seen them in the battlefield, not be susceptible to our airstrikes. But that's Iraq. The harder part is Syria. Syria is much more complicated, much more difficult because of the Assad regime, and we're trying to sort of thread a needle between. One needle we're trying to thread is defeating them militarily, but not having boots on the ground.
Yeah.
That's one needle. Another is supporting the opposition groups in Syria who are fighting ISIL, and then also maintaining our opposition to Assad. I mean, these are internal tensions in this strategy that are going to be difficult. And the final point I make is, this is not very. This doesn't sort of play well in Washington, but this is going to take multiple years. This is not a 3-month or 9-month effort. This is at least 3 years. Is how we sort of have thought about it.
Well, I'll come back to the question of boots on the ground, since obviously lots of people are debating whether or not there can be anything more than a modest degrading of ISIL's power without boots on the ground. But I'm coming back to law.
Okay.
It is the law school.
It is.
You've alluded already to the origins of the group in Al-Qaeda. Is that the justification? Are we all now operating under the authorization of military force? Is that the justification, or are we going directly to Article 2? What's going on here?
Right. So, my caveat is that I didn't play the role of the lawyer on this, and just as a structural matter. The lawyers are directly involved, and at NCTC we're an analytic organization, sort of where all the information comes together, and we're sort of the lead for analyzing terrorism information. We spent hours and hours. Our analysts went over to the Department of Justice and sat down in conference rooms for hours and hours and explained, okay, who is this group? Where do they come from? You guys will appreciate this. The analysts came to me complaining. They got like 12 pages of questions from the Department of Justice, and as if like somehow that was my fault, as known as the lawyer, right? So what the heck are we supposed to do this? And so I negotiated we're going to do a briefing as opposed to a written answers to those questions, because our analysts have lots of important work to do looking at the threat going forward, not sort of answering historical questions about the origins of ISIL. But it's I think as a way to start this answer. The structure of this is that the lawyers are involved at every stage, and they're constantly asking for more information to try to understand, okay, what would be the potential legal basis for strikes, action in Iraq, in Syria, and I think honestly looking for first and foremost the right answer, and then also looking at where there's space for the administration to provide policymakers with some degree of discretion. Because again, the lawyer's role, is what's lawful, where's the line, but then, where is there some opportunity for some decisions to be made, and where could sort of as it's often phrased, what could a reasonable policymaker decide to take a certain action, and that action be lawful? That's how we think about it. That's how the lawyers think about it. I can appreciate that being a lawyer. Actually, as we sit around the table in the Situation Room, there's a number of other lawyers in non-lawyer roles. So it's something to think about. All right. But to the gist of your question, so we look at it as both a domestic question and an international law question. So on the domestic side, yes, the answer is in terms of ISIL, we looked essentially to the authorization for use of military force from 2001, which authorized the government to take action against Al-Qaeda, the group responsible for 9/11, and associated forces. The question then becomes one, well, who is this group ISIL, and are they part of Al-Qaeda or an associated force? And the analysis essentially looked at the origins of the group. This group started as AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in 2004 under Zarqawi. I mentioned he pledged allegiance to bin Laden. They've sort of maintained some of the same hierarchy, some of the same goals, the same sort of tactics in terms of level of violence. And they now really think that they are not Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, the group we kind of refer to as Al-Qaeda Core with Zawahiri. They maintain that they are the true inheritors of bin Laden's legacy, that Zawahiri has strayed, that they are actually the ones who really have carried forth the mantle of Al-Qaeda. A number of other people, individuals within other Al-Qaeda affiliated groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the group in Yemen, have joined with ISIL, sort of acknowledging that role. Again, I think the analysis has been that they do fall within the AUMF because of the historical ties, the current effort to be that group that is now Al-Qaeda, and the fact that others are supporting them. So look, there are some. It's not a slam dunk, as they say, and that argument. I think there are other ways one could look at it, because they've also become at odds with Al-Qaeda.
Antagonistic.
Yeah, antagonistic. They are fighting with the Al-Nusra Front, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. So it's a somewhat complicated legal question. The international law basis is one of collective self-defense, and Iraq asked us to come in and help them. And with respect to Syria, and here I'm on my weakest ground. In terms of international law, I'd never really had much to do with international law, but I've been part of these discussions. It's both a matter with respect to ISIL, collective self-defense on behalf of the Iraqis, the Syrians not being able or willing to take on this fight on their own. And then in terms of this other group that we might want to talk about, the Khorasan group, which is in Syria, which is not part of ISIL. It's one of our own national defense. This is a group that is actually seeking to carry out external attacks against Europe and the United States.
Tell us about that group.
Sure. So, and this goes back, I'll refer back to my comment before about being open and talking a little bit more about the nature of the threats we face. I gave a talk a couple weeks ago at Brookings, and this was before the word Khorasan was sort of out there in the press. And part of my goal was to say, okay, ISIL, this was my talk. As it turned out, I'd agreed to do it a couple months before, and it turned out it was the day after Stephen Foley was beheaded. So, these are just extraordinarily brutal, vicious, tactics, obviously, and they really do obviously galvanize opinion. And I needed to both talk about the ISIL threat, especially in the kind of extraordinary circumstances of the violence that's taking place in Iraq and Syria by ISIL, but also to say there are other things that we're concerned about, especially if you think about it from the perspective of the United States and as a target. And among our most significant concerns, this group in Syria, now often referred to as the Khorasan group, which is made up of veteran Al-Qaeda guys who've been around, been with bin Laden, been in Pakistan, Afghanistan, been in that part of the region, and moved to Syria a couple years ago because they realized that Syria was such a significant safe haven, a place easy to get to. They could plot. There was obviously no security against them.
Failed state is a perfect
essentially failed
setting.
state. And so they moved there, and they've been plotting. And they're there because of the failed state status, because it is there is no security apparatus against them. But they're not focused on Assad. They are focused on advancing Western plotting. And it's been a real concern, and I know there have been references in the press to the fact that some of the security measures on airplanes that were put in place back in July were part of that in response to what we were seeing in the intelligence there. So that group, the legal basis there is also something that's been discussed, because that's not part of a collective self-defense. That group's not really focused on Iraq. We're doing that because of our own national interests.
I'm going to just ask two more questions and then invite you all to ask questions. I want to ask something on a slightly different subject, which is from the perspective of the NCTC, what has been the impact of disclosures about surveillance, about NSA, about,
Right.
what's on the internet?
Right. So this is obviously, I'm sure there are lots of discussion here, really fascinating set of issues. One of the things I did before I went to NCTC, I was the general counsel at NSA. And so I worked on these programs and the legal justification for them. And if you study this at all, or if you'll, and I'm not sure how much general awareness there is of the programs themselves, Section 215, the metadata program, Section 702, the content program that allows us to target non-U.S. persons overseas. So these were all part of what was revealed, at least in some degree of detail, that hadn't been previously revealed back in, I guess, in March of 2013, April of 2013. So what's the impact? I mean, we get asked that question a lot, because here we are now a year plus later. There's a real question, as this debate has sort of gone forward, what's the impact on our national security, on our collection capability in particular? So from my perspective, now NCTC, we're, as I said, an analytic organization. We're not a collection organization. So we rely on the big collection agencies, NSA, CIA, FBI. They're the sort of the big three that bring in information, and we have access to it. So we see all this information. We're the place that synthesizes it. And what as kind of both a person who is a consumer of it, but also I'm in the position of actually briefing the president. Was I need to start using the past tense, was in that position, and other senior policymakers on what we're seeing in terms of the threat. So there's no doubt in my mind that we are collecting less in terms of communications from terrorists than we were a year ago. That they have adopted ways to avoid surveillance. Now, they've always known or always suspected that their communications were subject to surveillance. This is not like a new thing to them that all of a sudden we were targeting them. That's been part of what they've been worried about since I've been involved in this. We've actually been able to watch terrorists take steps to avoid our surveillance, and then because they're security conscious, and then adapt and find ways to work around those. But what we've seen in the last year is a stepped up effort to avoid, for example, US-based service providers, or to use some of the encryption that's available, or just to drop out of communication altogether. And that hurts us because we can't collect. It also actually makes them less effective too. That's sort of hard to gauge because all of a sudden they're using couriers. Right. They're not as able. It takes them longer to communicate. But we are, again, no doubt in my mind that we're collecting less, and that some targets that we had a year plus ago have simply disappeared. And the encryption issue is compounded by the availability of lots of types of new encryption and ways to have your texts and emails sort of disappear using various applications. So it shouldn't be any shock. I mean, we revealed, if you look at, for example, some of the accounts on the web, for example, on Lawfare, it lists all the things that Snowden were leaked or purportedly in those documents. And so I can't really comment on whether those are true or not, but if you just look at that list of things, the vast majority of them have nothing to do with privacy and civil liberties. It's just sort of what NSA's capabilities are, the ways they did business. And we know that terrorists are quite sophisticated, that they look at these things and that they adapt in response. So that's a big part of it. The other thing, though, that I think bears mentioning in terms of the impact is sort of I guess two things. One is, and they're both sort of paradigm shifts. One is a paradigm shift with respect to how we and the intelligence community interacted with the other branches of government and what the oversight structure was like. And that, there's debate on whether that's for the good or the bad. I think that's an open question. But the kind of the deal that we worked under, the structure post-1978 with this passage of FISA was, we talked to the intelligence committees in classified session. They understood what we were doing. The FISA court oversaw this. The executive branch had controls. sort of that was how these programs worked. I think that's been that sort of foundation has been rocked, and whether that's enough. The other thing I'll mention very quickly is, but it's a really important one, is our relationship with providers. Companies that provide communication services, whether telephone or internet providers. And they now have with these revelations, they have a commercial interest in sort of standing up to the government in a way they never did before.
iPhone 6.
iPhone 6, I just got an iPhone 6. I turned in my BlackBerry on Friday and got an iPhone 6.
Wow. So. I think you can't be under any kind of surveillance. You may, if you forget your password, you're sunk.
That's right. That's right.
Post 9/11, you think about the 9/11 Commission report and the critique of the stovepiping of information. Would you say that operations are better now, that the 9/11 Commission would find something different if it inquired?
So I think that's actually a pretty good news story of all in all this sort of dire, scary news that we've talked about. I think that actually is a good news story. I mean, one way I got asked that question recently was, is ISIL, is this now like the new 9/11? Are we looking at a new Al-Qaeda? And one way to answer is, as a group, no, they're not really that focused on us. Now, left unchecked, given the territory, the resources, their overall goals, they could rise to something like that. I think, I think that that's at least a potential or possibility that's out there. But the biggest difference is how we're structured as a government, how we're postured. And one of the main features of that is the sharing of information. NCTC sort of is the organizational, personification of that. But it's quite we've come a long ways from where we were pre-9/11 in terms of our intelligence gathering, our intelligence sharing, our approach to counterterrorism as a government. And I think we actually met with the 9/11 commissioners earlier this year as they were sort of doing a 10-year retrospective, right? And we had this conversation, and they came out with an updated sort of review that I think basically reached that conclusion that the government is in a completely different place in terms of our sharing of information and lack of stovepipes.
So my last question, and so people can, if you want to ask a question, come up and to the mic, is to bring you back to your time at the law school, and then you did go to DOJ and do civil rights. How is the balance between rights and security being struck, and do lawyers play an important role in that? And what would you advise people who are interested in this as a field?
Yeah, so I think this, I think one aspect of the debate that's going on now that I think that's sort of personal to me, that the debate, the big meta debate between security and privacy and civil liberties, is that obviously the country is quite engaged in this, and it's been given the momentum of the leaks of NSA information. But again, sort of personal to me is the sense that this is not a new debate. This is something that people in government, that in my job, the people I worked with, we had all the time. We were always trying to find that right balance. Now, the difference is it wasn't sort of being played out in the Washington Post and the New York Times in the same way. And maybe that's a good thing. But it shouldn't be viewed that this is something that just occurred to everybody and people who came out of law school and went into these jobs. It's been going on a long time. People of good faith, really wrestling with these questions, trying to reach the right answer. But when I was in law school, there was no national security law society. There was no national security no career field. This is all completely new since I graduated in 1988. And so I think the opportunities, and sort of the last part of your question, I think there are extraordinary opportunities for lawyers. And as I said, I look around the table, and there are a number of us. Juan Zarate went here. He was in a job like this.
He's also teaching a class
and
here.
Teaches a class. Terrific guy. People are just come out of Harvard Law School, want to do something meaningful, important, be part of a broader public debate, part of a broader set of issues. It offers all kinds of great opportunities. The metaphor that I sometimes come back to when I think about lawyering in this field is Mike Hayden, who was the former CIA director, NSA director. He uses this metaphor about having, as an operator, he's on the operational side, military guy heading these agencies. He uses the metaphor of he wants chalk marks on your cleats, When he talks about the operators, he wants chalk marks on their cleats, meaning, he wants them right on that line. And I've talked to him about this. I said, fair enough. I understand why you feel that way, protecting the country, have to have that as your sort of image. But as a lawyer, that's really hard. You want your guys right on the line. Okay, so that, you're assuming too that, just to play that a little further, that line is easy to see, that it's straight, that it doesn't move, and all those things in fact are false. The line is hard to see. It's zigzags, it's constantly moving. And as the lawyer coming in and advising someone like Mike Hayden, who says, I want my guys on the line. So, look, if that sounds sort of fun and challenging to be in that position, then go for it. And it actually is. It actually is.
Well, great. I'm going to leave to others the question about boots on the ground right now, but also someone might want to ask about FISA and your involvement in the expansion of the powers, which was a very interesting part of your life. So let's start, and please identify yourself. Zoe, who are you?
Hi, I am Zoe. I'm Zoe Bedella. I'm a 2L and previously served in the Marine Corps. So I wanted to actually go with the boots on the ground question, and I know we've had at least a little bit of initial success with the airstrikes, but my suspicion is you can only go so far with that. So how far can we go? What do you see that accomplishing? Where do you think we get to the boots on the ground point? And then also related to that 3-year time frame, what do you see that looking like? What are we doing in those 3 years?
Yeah, so this is the tension in establishing as our ultimate goal the defeat of the group, so the no combat role, no combat boots on the ground. So I raised that as an issue. I think ultimately it is that the president has it right, that this is a fight that we want to enable the Iraqis and, to the extent we can, the moderate Syrians to take on themselves, not one that sort of should be the U.S. sort of in the lead on from a combat perspective on the ground. I think the airstrikes have been quite successful. We are going to see them be less successful, I think, as time goes on. You anticipated this in your question, because they've been operating out in the open in northern Iraq and eastern Syria. They're going to go to ground. They're going to adapt. They're going to go to more asymmetric tactics, terrorist tactics, and so some of the infrastructure targets. We've hit the oil refineries, the depots, the logistical hubs. Those will, there aren't going to be as many of those left, and so the airstrikes are going to be less important. But I do think ultimately the fundamental point of this has to be a fight that is by those countries and their regional partners is the right one. The 3-year, 3 years is actually even too short in some ways when you think about the ultimate goal that the president talked about in his speech at the UN last week of changing the mindsets of young people. He really focused on, stop teaching them to hate, and and he talked about that as a generational challenge, and so that is a generational challenge, and it's one that I think the U.S. sort of we especially when you think about inside this our own country, we struggle with what role the government should have in the countering the message, right. And that's we have. First Amendment just is something, a limitation in some ways about what we can do, compared to even places like the UK. But the 3 years is sort of I think the kind of the military and the more aggressive side of the campaign. The rest of it's generational.
Great. Please come and identify yourself.
Thank you, sir. It's a very instructive conversation. My name is Jiawei He from China, and I'm an LLM student here. My question is about the legal basis, of course. And you mentioned that the collective self-defense needs invitation or request. This is established law. Yeah, for the Iraqi part, it's no problem. However, if we attack ISIS on the territory of Syria, it seems that al-Assad has not implicitly invited the US to attack. So I think collective self-defense has not been met. However, you offer us a new legal standard that this country is unwilling or unable to fight against terrorists. So my question is, can you elaborate more on the definition of unwilling and unable? Is there any substantial or procedural limits? Will it be better to refer to UN or other collective determination, or is it okay for unilateral action? Second is that the political side. Would you please give us an overall picture of the risk of it? because some other countries will use this to argue that this country is unwilling and unable to fight against terrorists, therefore we have the right to attack these terrorists. But for many countries, this kind of terrorists can be freedom fighters.
Right.
So this legal perspective and political perspective, I appreciate a lot if you can offer us more information. Thank you.
Those are really good questions. So, and luckily, I did actually refer to my limitations on the international law side. I mean, look, I've been party to the discussions, you know, more of as the lawyers in the room have described how they analyze this question of unwilling or unable. I think, you know, as a factual matter, Assad, look, I mean, I think there's a willingness at some level to take on ISIL in Syria. You know, obviously they are, you know, at odds with each other. So he hasn't, you know, declined as a matter of intent to carry out attacks or to prevent ISIL from presenting a threat to Iraq or to the United States. But there is a capability question. From my perspective, the factual support comes most directly on the ability of the Syrian regime to effectively counter ISIL. I mean, I just think 3 years of civil war sort of bear that out. And you know, the legitimacy of our actions, I think it's a really interesting question. I think you raised the right question in terms of the politics of this and sort of how it would be viewed internationally, is that it could be used in other contexts by countries that, you know, we feel like we're right here. We feel like we've got that we're not overstepping what's appropriate under the international legal basis, but you could see another situation where a country might manipulate that standard. It's really one in terms of a process that is hashed out among the executive branch lawyers, and that's, you know, going back to your last question, sort of the role of the lawyers, where they have a lawyers group that meets constantly from the White House, the State Department, Justice Department, other departments, but those are sort of the key to really work through these, with the State Department in particular being in the lead on the international legal principles that are at play.
But isn't there a risk of now unilateralism becoming the response, and not even an effort to go to the UN or any other international body?
Yeah, so the government did provide the Article 51 notification to the UN, but yes, you know, I think there is, it undermines sort of this international legal order a bit, I suppose. I mean, that would be the argument when we act unilaterally. You know, my sense is that we didn't think that we had much of an option in terms of the UN and the Security Council.
I'm sure that is true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks so much for your presentation. My name is Shamus Malik. I'm a 2L. And following up on Zoe's question, I guess with the strikes against the Khorasan group, which seems to be embedded to some extent with the Nusra Front, do you think those strikes present some problems to our overall long-term strategy in terms of potentially pushing them towards reconciling with ISIS, or in undermining our legitimacy with some of the more moderate groups like the FSA, which sort of fight alongside the Nusra Front to some extent, but are probably necessary to fight ISIS if we're not going to have boots on the ground?
Right. It's another really good question. I mean, it's such a morass, and it's been that way since the onset of the conflict in Syria. And you know, the reluctance that we've had to provide in the last couple of years, provide direct military aid to the moderate opposition has been exactly the point you raised. I mean, they were fighting alongside the extremists like al-Nusra, and there was no way to be. We had limited ability to be confident that arms wouldn't make their way to groups like al-Nusra, which we saw, at least right now, not looking to attack, but having direct ties to al-Qaeda, and certainly would be a threat going forward. So, so there is the risk. That risk is still there. I think we can do, with time and energy, money, we can vet the moderate opposition to give us at least a decent shot that we're doing the right thing and not just ultimately supplying al-Nusra. I think the other thing that's happened is where those groups were fighting alongside each other, because the moderates saw al-Nusra as sort of the most effective fighting force against Assad over the last year. Really, they now have not. from my perspective, they are now more at odds than they were. Their interests are not in the same place that they were a year ago. So that, I think, is somewhat mitigating of the concern you raise. Was there another part to your question?
I guess the concern that it might
drive
towards ISIS. But
yeah, I think the arms is an issue. I don't really see that. The Khorasan group is it's embedded within al-Nusra, but it's somewhat separate and apart. It's got a different focus. I don't see. I guess I don't see a strong likelihood that the strikes on Khorasan targets will create a worse situation in terms of how the opposition is situated at this point.
Is there somebody else in line? Then I have another question, which is, especially, you alluded to this earlier, how much can counterterrorism policy take into account the risk that any action to deal with security could ignite opposition, more hatred? Mm-hmm. How do you factor that in?
We look at that question a lot, and we try to, through various ways, and we do this at NCTC, really assess, what is the impact of some of our policies, particularly, obviously, our policy for targeted strikes in places like Yemen and Somalia. I think the primary way is to, and we're moving in this direction. The president has directed, that we move toward more transparency along these lines, and he talked about last year in a speech at the National Defense University the policies that the government's adopted to cabin the exercise of that authority. Obviously we're talking about using drones in places like Somalia and Yemen, where we can hold up to the world that this is a carefully calibrated policy that really is based on a situation where we don't have an option to capture and where the person, the target, presents a continuing and imminent threat to U.S. persons, and that it's used in a targeted and sparing way that's consistent with the law and consistent with that policy, and that policy is enduring, again, beyond any one particular administration. I guess the other way is, so that's sort of the policies in the background. In terms of our actions, I think, the captures, the recent captures in Libya, one in Tripoli of individual Abu Anas al-Libi, who's facing trial in New York, and then in Benghazi of a guy named Abu Khattala, who was indicted for being part of the Benghazi attack in 2012. These are, you step back and think about it, these are pretty amazing operations where these are military operations where you have special forces capable of going into places like Tripoli and Benghazi, capturing an individual, and bringing them back here to stand trial. So you have a combination of intelligence, helping to explain what the situation was, where the guy is, what the situation is in Benghazi or Tripoli, combined with military capability that's really no other country in the world has that type of military capability, and law enforcement all together. So intelligence, military, law enforcement, all working together. Back to your question, Dean, sort of how's the government postured 10 years or 13 years after 9/11? This kind of seamless coordination is really impressive. And the fact that we are capturing someone, bringing them back here, putting them on trial in a federal court, sort of holds out to the world that we kind of mean what we say.
And it's a model that's not just war, it's also law.
Right.
Hi, my name is Titi Rasaki Mawano. So basically going back on your imminent threat qualification and basically the use of force and who we designate as an appropriate target. From what I've seen, it seems that imminent threat is kind of vaguely defined, as they might not necessarily be plotting an attack on the U.S. actively or anything like that. So basically where the government has significant leeway in defining what an imminent threat is, and furthermore, looking at who is an appropriate target. So the people who are kind of collateral damage, the government seems like it doesn't know necessarily who was killed in certain attacks, and how do we even justify, basically going back to how our actions could be exacerbating kind of sentiments on the ground. when we're killing people and we can't necessarily point out who it was and why they were killed, how is it that we're basically justifying those actions?
Right, so two separate questions in a way, both good ones. So, and I think you've honed in on the right sort of concept from a legal and policy perspective to, what does it mean for someone to pose an imminent threat? And I think it was John Brennan here, maybe a couple years ago, who talked about this. And I went back and looked at his speech, because I thought someone might ask me that question. And I'm afraid I don't have much of a better answer in a way, or maybe more satisfying. I do think, but look, I'm persuaded at least that what it means for a threat to be imminent can mean different things in different contexts. And when you have a threat that's posed by a group that has as its goal killing Americans, it operates in secret. We have limited capability to understand, its tactics on a day-to-day basis, but we have sufficient evidence to show that it's, putting in train a plot or some type of action that is designed to kill, U.S. persons. That we don't want to be in a position where imminence means we have to wait until the bomb is placed in the car and the car is parked in front of the embassy. That seems the wrong answer, and we need some flexibility in what constitutes imminence to allow us to take action in a way that's going to protect us. But also we need to be careful and rigorous in not letting that be expanded to the point where we just we use it too freely. And I think that's a real challenge. And I mean, for what it's worth, we struggle with that. We talk about that question. I'm often asked, so, what does imminence mean? This is going back to the legal, training, so some people are not as comfortable sort of talking about a word and what it means. And they think they've asked me this question, what does the intelligence community mean when it says imminent? As if, this is a magical word that we made up. It's, okay, you start with a dictionary. Yeah. What is the dictionary definition? You look at other contexts where it's used, you apply it to these facts. I mean, this is basic legal training, and it comes in, really handy, to be honest. And I think in the end, it's quite defensible, in the main. The issue of other people who are killed is a really difficult one. And I think we do have a pretty good idea, actually, when other people are killed, other than the target. We actually have a pretty good sense from our abilities to collect intelligence. And I think at least historically, it's been the case that these are quite effective in terms of limiting people who aren't the targets being killed. But I think that doesn't fully answer the question in the sense that it's still a concern, and from the perspective of creating more people, creating more animus toward the United States. And we just need to continue to find the right approach, one that's lawful, but also beyond lawful, because these are clearly lawful under both domestic and international law, but also the right policy, the right approach. And I not feeling too, I am out of the government, but I will say that I've been very impressed with the administration's approach to this, the caution and rigor with which these questions are approached and thought through.
I know some people have to go to class, so please don't hesitate to go to class. So please.
David Smith, I'm a 2L. Just a quick question about ISIS's strategy. And so we've seen with beheadings and whatnot, I guess, what's our understanding of their strategy towards us? Are they trying to intimidate us, bait us, elicit an overreaction so they can recruit more? What's their overall strategy? And if so, what's the best thing we can do to make sure we're not doing what ISIS wants us to do? Right.
Are they just trying to provoke us into this fight? Because if that's true, if that's their goal, then it's working, right? And no doubt. So it's, I've actually specifically, I sat around a table with a bunch of analysts and posed that exact question to them. It's a really important question. What's their goal with these beheadings? Because from one perspective, taking on the United States, I think in some ways, I've seen people like Peter Bergen say that 9/11 was a tactical success but a strategic failure for Al-Qaeda because it brought the United States into this in a way we wouldn't have been. One is just at an ideological level, this is what they believe. I do think there's a certain ideological sort of impetus behind it, and that these people deserve death. That's part of the ideology. But in terms of their
But the drama, the theater.
The theater, the putting it on. So one thing to note is we're not, it's not just the beheadings of 3 Westerners. There are hundreds of beheading videos and execution videos on YouTube. Or not necessarily on YouTube anymore, but on the internet. Mostly Sunni, mostly Shia, but also Sunni and then religious minorities. So it's not just us. I think the goal mainly is to intimidate the population with graphic depictions of violence. Do not oppose us. This will be your fate. That's what our analysts kind of came to. It was primarily an intimidation and then sort of relatedly recruitment. Some will be drawn to this because they're having so much success and nobody stands up to them, and this is the group to join because they've been so successful. Others will just be intimidated and will join or at least not oppose because of the intimidation. That's the explanation that made the most sense to me.
Thank you.
Last question.
Okay. I think this is a much drier question, but
And say who you are.
okay. I'm Jane Lee. I'm a 3L. I guess my question is, from my understanding, after 9/11, part of the creation of the NCTC was due to the understanding that there was a lack of communication between the intelligence committees. I guess my understanding is how has this agency changed the dynamics of communication between the different agencies? And also, if you could also elaborate on what you said earlier about FISA and the debate now or the dialogue now about expanding beyond that safeguard, what other measures are being considered? Thanks.
So I'll do this pretty quickly. The first question is like my favorite all-time question. I like to talk about my organization and how great it is. It's really easy for me. The FISA question, there's a couple things on the table. There's legislation, that's being considered in Congress. One of the changes that's in most of the bills has been to allow for the FISA court to have a, like an amicus role, to allow an independent or just a different voice. Because right now, similar to like if you got a criminal search warrant, the FISA court meets just with the government. And I did this for a couple of years. I practiced before the FISA court. It's just like you go with an application for a search warrant. Essentially, you just meet with the judge. The judge has advisors as a permanent staff, like permanent law clerks, which effectively work somewhat as skeptical questioners and experts. But it's not the same as having an outside voice. And where I think it probably would make a difference, or at least would it would at least add a degree of legitimacy to the court, and might actually be helpful. Is on these bigger questions, on these bigger, more programmatic type of applications or requests for authority from the FISA court, like the 215, or when the court, under this FISA statute, under the 2008 amendments, the court looks to see whether or not the government's procedures for targeting someone out the United States are consistent with the Fourth Amendment. Like, are they sufficiently designed to make sure that the target's not a U.S. person?
Right.
And there's, because if they are, then there's a Fourth Amendment issue, obviously. But so are those procedures, consistent with the Fourth Amendment? That's a question. That's a big question. That's not just asking to, target an individual because that person's an agent of a foreign power. I think that's a reasonable modification and reform. On the first question, so NCTC was created to end the stovepipes, and recognition that FBI and CIA both had information around 9/11, and they didn't share it, and so we had, it's an interesting sort of study so we got the legal authority in 2004 to have access to all this information, and we had the momentum of the 9/11 attacks, and it really has still taken us 10 years to break down the policy and bureaucratic and cultural obstacles to have actually a place that all the terrorism information comes together. One of the things that we did in the last couple of years, which is not without controversy, is, okay, we got all this terrorism information, all the CIA reporting, all the NSA reporting, we got FBI information about their terrorism cases, but what about, for example, visa applications from countries? So now, vast majority that's completely innocent. It has nothing to do with terrorism. But should NCTC have access to that? And in 2009, if you remember, there was a Christmas Day 2009 effort to take down a plane over Detroit. And we missed that guy. There was some information out there, and we missed him. And that incident gave new impetus to us for us to say, look, we need not just the terrorism information, but we need to have our databases have the ability to have data search against other data, so that when we have a CIA report that says this guy's a bad guy, and this guy's trying to travel here, here's a partial name, that we can compare that limited piece of information against, for example, DHS travel information.
Yeah.
That shows who's coming here. And that's been sort of the next step. We've largely done that. There's lots of safeguards around that, as you can imagine, because there's a lot of that information. I mean, again, the vast majority is not at all, nefarious. So real challenge, but I think the bottom line good news story is, NCTC is largely viewed as the hub of this, and we've, I think, largely succeeded in being, sort of fulfilling that vision of the 9/11 Commission in Congress and creating us in 2004.
Well, the really good news, besides the fact that you're here, is that you've agreed to come and help teach with Jack Goldsmith, right. And we really look forward to that immensely. Please join me in thanking Matthew Olsen.